The summer of 1787 hung heavy over the tidewater region of Virginia, a season thick with humidity and secrets. The rivers that coiled through the land shimmered like veins beneath the skin of an old and dying empire. Tobacco fortunes had risen, plantations sprawled across the valleys, and beneath the fragile civility of colonial gentility, rot had already set in. It was in this air dense with decay disguised as piety that Father Edmund Sterling built his Cathedral of Deceit. The locals called it St. Augustine Seminary, though few ever dared to venture near its gates. The estate stood on 340 acres of forestland, isolated by design far enough from Richmond to avoid curiosity, yet close enough for the wealthy to send their sons under the illusion of redemption. The Gothic towers rose from the earth like blackened teeth, their windows narrow and tall, their stone faces cold even in the August heat. The bells that tolled each morning sounded more like lamentations than hymns. Father Edmund Sterling was not a man born for holiness. He was the third son of a merchant clever, restless, and ungoverned by conscience. Where his elder brothers inherited the family's legitimate trade in tobacco and textiles, Edmund inherited something far more corrosive, an instinct for human weakness. He understood the hunger for control, the shame that stalked every powerful man, and the price people would pay to bury their sins. His idea of a seminary had begun as an experiment in manipulation, a sanctuary for secrets disguised as salvation. His proposal to establish a Catholic institution in Protestant Virginia had been met with skepticism and quiet scandal. Yet the Sterling name, polished by generations of wealth, carried enough credibility to mask even his most unholy intentions. Construction began in 1786. Imported stonemasons from Europe worked under his supervision, erecting a structure that was more fortress than monastery. Beneath the chapel, whose ceiling was painted with angels whose eyes seemed to watch every visitor, ran a network of limestone corridors. These were not built for prayer. They were built for control. When the seminary opened its doors the following spring, 12 young men were delivered by their families, each carrying with him not only luggage and letters of recommendation, but the unspoken burden of scandal. Some had defied their fathers. Others had uncovered family dealings that could not survive daylight. All had been promised discipline, spiritual correction, and discretion. Edmund Sterling received them with the composure of a saint and the calculation of a banker. Salvation requires surrender, he told them during their first supper, his eyes glinting like candlelight reflected in glass. Here, the world you knew ends. Only obedience remains. At first, life at St. Augustine appeared orderly, even tranquil. The students attended theology lectures, studied Latin, copied scripture by hand, and spent their evenings in silent prayer. Letters home spoke of long hours, strict routines, and the stern but fatherly presence of Sterling himself. Families were reassured the system was working. Their troublesome sons were quieting down. Their reputations, too, were safe. But small details began to drift through the walls of propriety like smoke. The students' letters, once individual and lively, grew eerily similar, same phrasing, same tone, same unwavering devotion to their spiritual rebirth. When visitors came, they noticed the same strange serenity in the young men's eyes, the same too perfect composure. None of them fidgeted, none of them spoke out of turn. In October 1789, the first whisper of unease took human shape. Jonathan Whitmore, eldest son of a Charleston shipping magnate, had been one of the first enrolled. Before his admission, he had stumbled upon discrepancies in his father's cargo ledger's shipments that declared tobacco but carried far darker commodities. He had confronted his father. A week later, he was on his way to St. Augustine Seminary. When months passed without word, the Whitmore family sent their overseer, Thomas Hartwell, to investigate. What Hartwell found chilled him in a way no plantation night had ever done. The seminary was immaculate. He was greeted by silent servants, led through echoing corridors that smelled of incense and limewash. The chapel was filled with music, low, haunting, disciplined. Everything seemed in order until he asked to see Jonathan. "Your son is in spiritual retreat," Father Sterling said with a benevolent smile. "He has embraced silence as the truest form of prayer." Hartwell, who had handled men's lives for 30 years, recognized evasion at once. He insisted on seeing the boy, if only from a distance. Sterling agreed on one condition. "You must not speak to him," he said softly. "Words can undo what grace has built." That evening, Hartwell stood at the back of the chapel as the young men entered for evening prayer. The flickering candles painted their faces in gold and shadow. They moved in perfect unison, too perfect. Their voices rose and fell as one, each syllable aligned, each gesture mirrored. When Hartwell counted the heads, there were only 19. Yet Sterling had said there were 37 students in residence. Among those 19 faces, Hartwell saw Jonathan. The boy's eyes were open but unseeing, his lips moving mechanically. There was no recognition, no flicker of memory. The boy who had once defied his father now bowed with the docility of a man hollowed out from within. When Hartwell left that night, he told the Whitmores only that their son was well. He never spoke of the chapel again. Within months, the same strange peace spread among Virginia's elite. Families whispered of miraculous transformations of sons who had returned to the fold of obedience. Few questioned the cost. St. Augustine's Seminary flourished. Sterling's reputation grew. Enrollments tripled. The wealthy called him a healer of souls. The desperate called him a savior. And no one, not one, realized that every whispered confession, every tear, stained repentance, was being written down in the ledgers of Sterling's private study, bound in leather and sealed with wax. He did not believe in God. He believed in leverage, and by the close of 1789, he possessed enough leverage to control half the families of Virginia. By the turn of 1790, St. Augustine's Seminary had become a whisper of power across the upper echelons of Virginia society, a sanctuary for secrets wrapped in the language of faith. Its name was spoken with reverence and relief by families who could afford its silence, and with dread by those who could not. The white spires against the dark forest had come to symbolize a kind of moral quarantine where sin could be quietly contained, not cleansed. Inside its gates, however, Father Edmund Sterling's vision had evolved into something far beyond religious education. He had found his purpose not in scripture, but in control. The mind, he had learned, was a pliable instrument if tuned by the right combination of fear, shame, and longing. His experiment began in the most civilized way possible: structure. Each student's day was divided into precise intervals: prayer, study, reflection, silence. Bells marked the hours. Sleep was permitted only after confession. Meals were taken in complete quiet. Every movement was watched by tutors and attendants whose loyalty lay not in God, but in Father Sterling's private payroll. At first, the young men resisted. They whispered in the dormitories, laughed in defiance, clung to memories of home. But St. Augustine was patient. Resistance here was simply a stage of refinement. Sterling's method relied not on punishment but on erosion, a gradual, relentless softening of the will. The process always began the same way. During spiritual consultation, each student was invited into Sterling's study, a dim room lined with candles and smelling faintly of laudanum. The priest would listen with gentle intensity as confessions spilled out, fights with fathers, envy of brothers, guilt over hidden acts. He would nod, record nothing, and whisper prayers of absolution. The students left believing they had been unburdened. What they did not know was that their words were being recorded elsewhere in secret journals hidden beneath the chapel floorboards, bound in black leather, sealed with their family crests. Sterling's assistants, men of uncertain origin and too clean hands administered medicinal tonics. To the students each evening, small crystal vials added to the sacramental wine. The doses were measured precisely, just enough to dull suspicion and sharpen obedience. By the end of the first month, the laughter in the dormitories had faded. By the third, most of the students spoke only when addressed. Their letters home continued. Of course, Sterling was too clever to forbid them, but the tone changed. Gone were the frustrations, the yearning for freedom, the complaints about endless scripture. In their place were formulaic praises for discipline, gratitude for correction, and declarations of spiritual peace that sounded rehearsed. The families were overjoyed. He is finally maturing, they said at dinner tables, unaware that every letter had been dictated word for word from a script designed by Sterling himself. The seminary's chapel, a hall of echoing marble and pale glass, became the stage for his masterpiece. Each evening, he conducted what he called the Litany of Renewal, a ritual designed not to worship God, but to synchronize the minds of his students. He would stand before them, hands raised, voice low and rhythmic, repeating verses that blended scripture with suggestion. You are not your past. You are the will that obeys. To resist is to remain in darkness. To surrender is to see the light. Night after night, the rhythm worked its way beneath their thoughts. By the end of each session, many students swayed unconsciously, breathing in unison, their pupils dilated, their eyes glassy with serenity. The transformation was slow, deliberate, and absolute. By the second year, Sterling could predict how long it would take to break any given mind. A strong-willed youth 6 months, a proud heir 4, the meek ones 2 months, sometimes less. Each became what he called refined souls, emptied of rebellion, molded into docile, faithful instruments. Yet the true brilliance of Father Sterling's design was not in controlling the sons. It was in controlling the fathers. Every confession gathered during spiritual counseling, every whispered fear, every fragment of family shame was transcribed and catalogued. The ledgers grew thicker by the week, 1 volume for the Whitmores and their slave trading routes disguised as tobacco shipments, another for the Carters whose plantations hid vanished tenant farmers, a third for the Randolphs whose ledgers were soaked in illegal maritime profits. When a father wrote demanding his son's return, Sterling would respond with kindness and a subtle reminder. Your son has confided deeply, he would write. He carries burdens that must be treated with great discretion. For the preservation of both his soul and your family's honor, continued tuition is recommended. If payment arrived late, the tone changed. The boy's repentance has progressed, but temptation remains near. Certain truths must never leave sacred ground. It was never phrased as a threat, yet every man who received such letters understood. Silence had a price, and it grew dearer each season. By 1793, the seminary's income rivaled that of the plantations that funded it. The original tuition of £50 had multiplied tenfold. Families continued to pay not for education, but for protection. And the more they paid, the deeper they sank into Sterling's web of complicity. The most loyal families began recommending St. Augustine to their peers not out of faith, but fear. Each new student meant another family bound to secrecy, another confession collected, another layer of influence for the man who called himself father. Meanwhile, the students who resisted most fiercely were moved to the lower chambers, limestone corridors beneath the main hall. Officially, these were cells of contemplative silence, reserved for those on the path to enlightenment. In truth, they were laboratories of obedience. Here, Sterling tested his doctrines of compliance. The air was thick with incense and damp stone, the silence absolute except for the faint echo of footsteps and the dripping of water through the rock. Meals were minimal, sleep was rationed, every second was part of the experiment. By candlelight, The young men sat with open scriptures they could no longer comprehend, their minds clouded by a haze of narcotic calm. When they spoke, it was in fragments of psalms and dreams, half prayer, half hallucination. In one of his journals, Sterling recorded his philosophy in a single sentence: "Faith is not belief. Faith is the absence of doubt." And he had perfected the removal of doubt. In the spring of 1793, when he looked out from his study window over the courtyard, he saw not students, but creation's rows of obedient sons who would return to their families as hollow vessels of compliance. They would speak little, question less, and carry within them the seeds of their family's own destruction. But for all his precision, Sterling underestimated one thing: curiosity. Among the rows of silent devotees, one student still watched the world differently, a young man named Charles Randolph, sent to the seminary after uncovering his family's illegal dealings in slave ships and smuggled currency. Unlike the others, Charles's defiance did not fade. He obeyed the rituals, spoke the prayers, wrote the letters, yet behind his calm eyes, something remained unbroken. And it was through that single, silent fracture in Sterling's machine that the first light of resistance began to slip through the darkness of St. Augustine Seminary. The fog that rolled over the Virginia lowlands in the spring of 1793 seemed to belong not to weather but to memory, a shroud laid gently over the sins of men. The name St. Augustine Seminary had by now become legend among the Tidewater elite. Its reputation thrived in whispers, a holy institution where disobedient sons found piety, where scandals dissolved behind locked chapel doors. Yet among the few who had glimpsed the young men upon their rare visits home, something else was whispered too, a look in their eyes, blank yet obedient, as if their souls had been neatly folded away and stored somewhere in Father Sterling's archives. Inside the seminary walls, time had ceased to behave like time. The bells still rang, the prayers still echoed, but the rhythm of life had become mechanical, too precise to feel human. Father Edmund Sterling presided over it all with a calm that bordered on divinity. His once humble experiment had become an empire of control, a machine whose gears were guilt, shame, and dependency. Each night, he wrote in his journals by candlelight, documenting the refinement of his process. The pages were filled not with scripture, but with calculations, measurements of laudanum doses, patterns of compliance, notes on which confessions yielded the most profitable leverage. To him, the seminary was no longer a sanctuary. It was a living organism feeding on the silence of the powerful. Sin, he wrote, is not the disease. It is the cure, for it teaches men what they will pay to keep it secret. His system had become self-sustaining. The families continued to pay more each year, trapped by the very confessions that had bought their peace. The sons, too docile to rebel, ensured the continuity of the web. Sterling's influence had begun to reach beyond Virginia, drawing the attention of merchants from the Carolinas, Maryland, and even the northern colonies. He was no longer merely a priest, he was an institution. But every perfect structure carries within it a flaw, and in Sterling's Cathedral of Obedience, that flaw bore the name Charles Randolph. Charles had been at the seminary for almost 3 years. In his first months, he had fought the system, resisted the routines, refused the confessions, written secret notes beneath his mattress. But resistance at St. Augustine was not crushed violently. It was dissolved like salt in water. The tonics had dulled his fire, the isolation had softened his voice, and the endless repetition of Sterling's litanies had begun to strip away the edges of his will. And yet, somewhere deep within, a single spark refused to die. He began to observe. In the chapel, while the others repeated the prayers, his eyes drifted toward the staff who stood in the shadows, men whose hands bore the calluses not of priests, but of soldiers. In the infirmary, he noticed that the same bottles of tonic reappeared under different labels. He began pretending to drink them, letting the drug trickle beneath the table. Slowly, the fog in his mind began to thin. One night, while retrieving his coat from the refectory, he saw Father Sterling speaking to a visitor, a man in military uniform, though his insignia were foreign. Their conversation was hushed but urgent, punctuated by the glint of coins passed from palm to palm. He caught a single phrase before the door shut. "The Crown appreciates your continued discretion." It was then that Charles realized St. Augustine's purpose was not merely religious or financial, it was political. In the years that followed, subtle changes rippled through the seminary. The arrival of new students always coincided with discreet shipments of supplies, medical equipment, ledgers, and crates sealed with foreign emblems. The sermons began to reference obedience to higher powers, the litanies to sacred order. The more Charles listened, the more he understood. The seminary was not a place of faith. It was a factory of control, and its product was silence. Meanwhile, miles away in Richmond, Thomas Jefferson Randolph was noticing a different kind of silence, the silence of unanswered letters. His brother's handwriting, once spirited and uneven, had become cold and mechanical. Each letter repeated the same phrases, as if copied from a catechism. When Thomas compared Charles's last 3 letters, he found entire sentences identical, even in punctuation. A merchant by training and a skeptic by nature, Thomas had spent his life reading contracts and accounts, spotting discrepancies others missed. To him, words were ledgers, and Charles's letters did not balance. He began to inquire quietly among his peers, other merchants, plantation heirs, and political acquaintances. What he found was alarming. Nearly every powerful family he spoke to had a son at St. Augustine, or had sent one in recent years. And all described the same transformation. Defiance turned to obedience, arrogance to serenity, individuality to silence. Yet none dared to question it aloud. The seminary was too useful, too sacred, too dangerous. By 1795, rumors began to circulate of boys who had not returned at all. Officially, they had taken vows or chosen lifelong devotion. In private, their families whispered of mysterious illnesses, sudden deaths, and closed coffins sent home without explanation. But the payments continued, and the silence held. Thomas Randolph's unease turned to obsession. He began tracing financial records, shipping manifests, property deeds, charitable donations. He found that Father Sterling's seminary received enormous shipments of medical instruments and opiates, far beyond what a small school would require. He also found that the seminary's account books linked indirectly to British commercial agents operating under neutral aliases. Each discovery pushed him deeper into a web of connections that seemed to stretch from Virginia's plantations to London's counting houses. And at the center of it all stood the serene figure of Father Edmund Sterling, untouchable, unchallenged, and unseen by those he owned through fear. Meanwhile, back at St. Augustine, Charles had begun keeping his own record scraps of parchment, hidden behind loose stones, written in trembling hands still unsteady from withdrawal. He documented everything, the routines, the rituals, the dosages, the names of students moved to the lower levels who never returned. He planned to escape, but the seminary was built like a maze. Corridors twisted upon themselves, doors locked from both sides, and guards walked the halls disguised as monks. Still he watched and waited. One winter morning, while assisting in the seminary library, he discovered something that froze his blood, a thick ledger bound in red leather, bearing his own family's crest. Inside were pages of notes written in Sterling's hand, details of his father's illicit trading network, names of partners, amounts exchanged, dates of shipments. At the bottom of one page, a chilling line, Charles Randolph subject demonstrates resistance, increased dosage, possible isolation required. He knew then that his time was running short. That night, under the faint glow of moonlight through stained glass, Charles hid the ledger beneath the altar and prayed not to God, but to time, to hold on long enough for someone to find it. In Richmond, that someone was already listening. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph received word that several families were quietly hiring investigators to inquire into the seminary's affairs, he knew he was not alone. Their findings matched his suspicions. The seminary's tuition had risen to absurd levels, and those who questioned it received carefully worded reminders of their sons' confidential confessions. It was not a school. It was an extortion network wrapped in the robes of faith, and still no one dared to act. But Thomas was not like the others. He was the one brother who had always asked why, the one voice in the Randolph family that questioned even profit when it stank of cruelty. His father had called it a weakness. Thomas now understood it was the only weapon he had. In the winter of 1797, he made his decision. He would uncover whatever truth lay behind those iron gates, even if it meant destroying his own family's name to do so. For in the game Father Sterling played, silence was the currency, and Thomas Jefferson Randolph was about to become the first man who refused to pay. By the winter of 1798, the forests surrounding St. Augustine Seminary had grown unnaturally still. The crows no longer nested near its towers. The river that wound past its estate ran quiet, as if even the current hesitated to disturb what lay beneath its reflection. The seminary, once a symbol of redemption, now stood like a monument to silence, a place where sons were sent and seldom seen again. Inside those walls, Father Edmund Sterling's empire had reached its zenith. The machinery of his faith-driven extortion was operating with perfect precision. Dozens of families across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Maryland were bound to him through fear, each paying not for salvation, but for secrecy. The seminary's ledgers overflowed with gold, and its underground vaults overflowed with sins. By now, Sterling's mind had transcended morality altogether. To him, the seminary was no longer an institution, it was an experiment in the manipulation of human will. Each student was a subject, each confession data, each family a lever of control. The moral language of religion was simply a mask, a divine vocabulary used to conceal psychological engineering. He had begun referring to his methods as the doctrine of refinement. In his private notes, written in meticulous Latin, he described it as the purification of human obedience through calibrated deprivation. He believed that the soul, stripped of choice and numbed by devotion, could be molded into the perfect instrument not of God, but of whoever held the confessional key. And yet, even perfection has its flaws. One such flaw now walked freely through Richmond in the form of Thomas Jefferson Randolph, whose search for his brother had become a crusade. His investigation, once quiet and contained, was now expanding into forbidden territories, into archives, merchant accounts, and private correspondence of the elite. He had begun to notice a pattern. The seminary's most generous donors were also the colony's most legally vulnerable men. Judges, merchants, even members of the clergy all had quietly directed vast sums of money to Father Sterling under the pretext of charity. Yet when Thomas compared shipping manifests and estate ledgers, he discovered that much of this charity was paid not in coin, but in silence. Every payment corresponded to a buried scandal, a smuggling scheme dismissed in court, a mysterious disappearance never investigated, a debt suddenly forgiven. The seminary, it seemed, was both a bank and a noose. But Thomas's search hit a wall until he met Martha Henley. Martha was the widow of Dr. Samuel Henley, a physician from Williamsburg who had died 2 years earlier under what had been called natural causes. She was a woman of sharp intelligence and quiet sorrow, her face prematurely aged by grief and unanswered questions. When Thomas approached her, she listened in silence, then fetched a leather-bound notebook from her late husband's study. The name written on the first page made Thomas's blood run cold. St. Augustine Seminary. Dr. Henley, it turned out, had been one of the few physicians granted access to the seminary's inner chambers. His notes described medical consultations requested by Father Sterling himself, inquiries about the long-term effects of opiate administration on young men, methods for inducing docility without physical restraint, and techniques for simulating natural illness. Henley's handwriting grew shakier with each entry. The final pages were a descent into terror. Have examined 5 subjects, symptoms consistent with chronic laudanum dependency, their condition misrepresented as spiritual fatigue. I fear this is not treatment, it is conditioning. These boys are being unmade. The last entry, dated only days before his death, read, "The Sterling arrangement represents a violation of human dignity so profound it cannot be tolerated. I must speak." But he never had the chance. Officially, Dr. Henley had died of heart failure. Martha, now reading her husband's words aloud to Thomas in a trembling whisper, believed otherwise. She recalled the night of his death, the strange visitor who had come to their door, the smell of incense on his coat, and the sealed envelope marked with the seminary's crest that had disappeared from her husband's desk the next morning. Thomas and Martha, bound by grief and anger, formed an alliance born of desperation. She provided her husband's notes, he provided the means to act. Together, they began to plan. They knew that confronting Sterling directly would be suicide. The seminary was too protected, too entangled with powerful families. To expose it, they would have to catch it in the act to force the truth into daylight. For months, Thomas gathered evidence, financial ledgers linking the seminary to British merchant houses, testimonies from servants who had once worked there, and coded letters from former students' families. Meanwhile, Martha searched through her husband's effects for any remaining trace of his correspondence with Sterling. In February 1799, she found it. Inside a false compartment of Henley's medical bag lay a bundle of hidden papers, sketches, letters, and a list of names. The sketches were anatomical precise, horrifying illustrations of human bodies subjected to controlled degradation. The letters between Sterling and Dr. Henley revealed that the seminary was not merely drugging its students. It was experimenting on them. One letter, dated November 1796, read, "The refractory subjects show remarkable decline after 3 weeks of deprivation combined with altered dosage. The process must appear spiritual in nature. Death, when necessary, should bear the marks of divine exhaustion." The list of names beneath it included 23 students labeled resolved and 12 marked pending resolution. Among those 12 was Charles Randolph. Thomas stared at the paper for a long time, unable to breathe. The realization struck with the precision of a blade. His brother was not merely imprisoned, he was scheduled to die. That night, as a winter storm battered Richmond, Thomas and Martha made their plan. They would infiltrate the seminary under the guise of a medical inspection, a last echo of Dr. Henley's authority, and expose whatever truth lay hidden beneath its chapel. 3 weeks later, on the cold evening of May 17th, 1799, they arrived at St. Augustine's gates. The building loomed against the storm like a dark cathedral rising from the soil of sin. Lightning flashed across the stained glass, casting fractured saints across the stone. Inside, the corridors were candlelit and silent, the air thick with incense and the faint metallic tang of something that was not prayer. They moved quickly, guided by Martha's memory of her husband's descriptions. Beneath the chapel, through a narrow iron door half hidden by drapery, they found a stairwell descending into the earth. What awaited them below was not a seminary. It was a laboratory of obedience. The limestone chambers stretched beneath the chapel like veins beneath pale skin. Within them, narrow cells lined the walls, each containing a cot, a Bible, and a boy whose eyes no longer knew how to see. The air was heavy with laudanum and decay. Some whispered verses under their breath, others stared blankly, murmuring prayers that had lost all meaning. In one chamber, Thomas found Charles. He was pale, his wrists marked with bruises from restraints, his breath shallow. A ledger hung by his bedside, its title coldly clinical. Subject C. R. Final phase. Predicted mortality, 7 days. Charles's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then wide with faint recognition. "Thomas," he rasped, voice brittle as ash. "I prayed you would not come here." But Thomas only whispered, "I had no choice." As Martha tended to Charles, her lantern light caught something carved into the wall, a series of marks like tally lines, hundreds of them. At the end of the row, the words scratched faintly into the stone, "God sees what men forget." Deeper in the tunnels, they found a chamber that froze their hearts. It was Father Sterling's true sanctuary, a circular room lined with ledgers and sealed boxes, each marked with the crest of a family. Within them were documents, letters, blackmail material that could destroy the social fabric of the colony in a single stroke. But it was not the papers that horrified them most, it was the equipment. Tables fitted with restraints, vials of chemicals, medical diagrams annotated in Sterling's hand. This was where the unrefined students had been brought, those who resisted too long, those whose silence could not be guaranteed. Martha recognized her husband's handwriting on one final page pinned to the wall. "He believes he is building order, but he is building a tomb." Then, from the far end of the room, a voice echoed calm, measured, and unmistakable. "Indeed I was," said Father Edmund Sterling. He stepped forward from the shadows, his robes immaculate despite the filth around him, a candle in one hand and a pistol in the other. Behind him, armed men emerged from the darkness, the seminary's staff, now revealed for what they were, soldiers in clerical disguise. "You should not have come, Mr. Randolph," Sterling said, his tone almost regretful. "You and your lovely companion have ruined years of sanctified work, and yet perhaps this is providence, for in every experiment there must be those who prove the rule." He gestured toward the ledgers. "Do you know what power lies in these pages? The very families that govern Virginia, the men who preach morality and commerce, I hold their souls in my hands. To expose me is to destroy them. To destroy them is to destroy the colony itself." Thomas clenched his fists. "Then perhaps it deserves destruction." Sterling smiled, a thin, patient smile. "Ah, then you are the dangerous kind. The man who believes truth is worth the cost. Tell me, Mr. Randolph, will you still believe that when your brother dies in your arms?" Before Thomas could answer, chaos erupted, a shot, a scream, the crash of glass as lanterns shattered, and beneath the chapel of St. Augustine, the silence that had ruled for 12 years was finally broken. The dawn of May 18th, 1799, broke not with the calm gold of sunrise, but with a bruised, red light that bled through the clouds like a wound refusing to close. The forests surrounding St. Augustine Seminary seemed to shudder in the wind, as if nature itself anticipated the violence about to unfold. Beneath the chapel, the world was already burning not in flame, but in revelation. Father Edmund Sterling stood among his ledgers and medical instruments, his composure untouched even as chaos stirred in the corridors above. The faint sound of shouting echoed through the stone, the clatter of boots, the cries of awakening students. His men, loyal guards disguised as monks, had taken up arms, and yet Sterling was calm. He turned to Thomas Jefferson Randolph and Martha Henley, who now stood beside the cot where Charles lay, pale and trembling but alive. The priest's candlelight flickered against his face, casting long shadows that made his eyes appear hollow, bottomless. "Do you hear it?" he asked softly. "The sound of order dying. The world you know, this colony of frauds and fools, cannot survive what you've done. You've brought the light, Mr. Randolph, but you've forgotten what light does. It burns." Thomas leveled the pistol he had taken from one of the fallen guards. "You've murdered children," he said, voice shaking but steady. Sterling's expression did not change. "No, I've transformed them into peace, into purity, into silence. You mistake suffering for evil because you cannot comprehend control." The crash of a door above interrupted him, then the unmistakable sound of muskets. Sterling's smile flickered, a brief fracture in the mask of holiness. Outside, the Colonial militia had arrived. Thomas's plan, conceived in desperation, had depended on timing, and he had not failed. Before entering the seminary, he had dispatched riders to summon local militia, loyal not to the gentry but to justice. Men with no sons in St. Augustine, men who owed nothing to the Sterling family name. When they reached the seminary gates at dawn, they found the doors barred and the bells silent. Then came the first shot, and the old stones, witnesses to 12 years of deceit, began to tremble. Down in the catacombs, Sterling turned to the ledgers stacked like tombstones. "Do you imagine they'll let you live after this?" he asked. "You've signed your family's death warrant. Every name in these books ties to a scandal. Every father, every merchant, every judge. Expose me, and you expose yourselves." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then let the truth destroy us all." A sharp crack split the air, not from a musket, but from the ceiling itself. Dust fell like ash. The storm outside was hammering against the seminary's roof, and with each distant blast of thunder, the foundations groaned. Martha stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "This isn't about God, Sterling. It's about power. You used faith as a weapon and called it virtue." Sterling regarded her as though she were a curious insect. "And you, the physician's widow, what do you think your husband was doing here? He aided me. He administered the treatments. His conscience failed him, and so I corrected it." Martha's hand trembled around her lantern. "You killed him." He smiled faintly. "He died of enlightenment." Before Thomas could answer, a rumble shook the floor, the blast of cannon fire from outside. The militia had breached the outer wall. The candles flickered wildly, their flames bending as though afraid. Sterling straightened his robes. "So it ends." He walked to the nearest shelf, pulling free a thick ledger bound in black leather, the master record of his empire. "But not for me." He tossed the candle into the shelves. The parchment caught instantly, fire crawling up the pages like serpents awakening. "No." Thomas lunged forward, but Sterling struck him across the jaw with the pistol and turned toward a narrow stairwell at the far end of the room. The smoke spread fast, thick and oily, filling the chamber with the stench of burning ink. Martha dropped to her knees beside Charles, covering his mouth with her sleeve. "Thomas," she shouted, "we have to move." Thomas staggered to his feet, blood trickling from his lip, and fired once, twice. The second shot struck Sterling in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall. The priest looked down at the spreading red on his robe and laughed, not from pain, but from wonder. Even now, he whispered, "You misunderstand me. You think I sought wealth or control, but I sought truth, the truth that men will always trade morality for survival." He disappeared into the smoke before Thomas could fire again. Above them, the world was collapsing. The militia stormed through the corridors, prying open doors, cutting chains, pulling pale, trembling young men into the light. Many of them screamed at the brightness. Others clung to their rescuers, whispering prayers they no longer understood. In the chapel, soldiers found evidence of ritual altars stained with chemicals, walls carved with Latin invocations, twisted into commands of obedience. The air reeked of laudanum and burned oil. Thomas, Martha, and Charles stumbled through the labyrinth below as the flames spread. The ledger's years of confessions, blackmail, and corruption burned around them, their ashes spiraling upward like the souls of the damned. At last, they reached the stairwell to the surface. Behind them, the ceiling cracked, spilling fire and stone. When they emerged into the courtyard, dawn had broken fully, but the light was red and furious. Smoke poured from the chapel roof, and the bells that had once called men to prayer now tolled their own requiem as they melted in the heat. The militia captain approached Thomas, "We've secured most of the staff. Some resisted. The priest, Thomas, shook his head. He's gone." Indeed, Father Edmund Sterling had vanished. Whether he had perished in the flames or escaped into the forests, no one would ever know. But the seminary, his creation, his kingdom, was finished. By mid-morning, the last of the fire had been smothered. Soldiers combed the ruins and unearthed horrors that would haunt them until their deaths. Unmarked graves beneath the garden, rusted shackles cemented into stone, medical instruments blackened by soot. They found 23 bodies, each preserved in varying states, their deaths carefully staged just as Dr. Henley's notes had foretold. But among the survivors, 19 in total, was Charles Randolph. His body was broken, his mind clouded, yet his eyes held a faint, distant clarity. He looked upon the ruins and whispered, "It's over." Thomas knelt beside him. "It's just beginning," he said, and he was right. In the weeks that followed, the truth of St. Augustine Seminary spread like a plague through Virginia's elite. Newspapers printed partial accounts, rumors filled the rest. The names in Sterling's remaining ledgers, those rescued from the flames, were enough to destroy dozens of the colony's most respected families. Judges resigned in disgrace, merchants vanished overnight. Plantations went bankrupt, but for every man exposed, 2 more found ways to conceal their ties. Sterling's empire might have burned, but his influence lingered like smoke, seeping into the lungs of society. Charles never recovered fully. The drugs had left his mind a fractured mirror, reflecting fragments of who he once was. He spoke little and slept often, haunted by dreams of hymns sung by hollow voices. His brother kept him close, caring for him not out of duty, but guilt, the kind that never fades. Martha Henley became something of a ghost herself. She refused the militia's gratitude and vanished from Richmond, her husband's notes buried in a sealed box that would never be opened again. Some said she joined a convent, others claimed she wandered the countryside, visiting graves that no longer bore names. As for Father Sterling, his body was never found. Some believed he died in the fire. Others swore they saw him years later in London, serving as an advisor to a group of British investors. The truth remained as elusive as the man himself. But the ruins of St. Augustine Seminary stood as testimony, scorched, silent, and unholy. Children in nearby towns whispered that on stormy nights the chapel bells still rang, even though no bell remained, and sometimes travelers passing through the old forest swore they saw a figure in priest's robes walking among the trees, whispering prayers to no God at all. For evil, once refined, never truly dies. It merely changes form, waiting, watching, and learning how to speak again. When the flames of St. Augustine Seminary finally died, they left behind more than charred stone and blackened wood. They left behind an emptiness that stretched across Virginia like a shadow at noon, an unspoken stain upon its history. For years afterward, the site was avoided, even by the animals that once roamed freely through the Tidewater woods. The soil itself seemed tainted, the grass reluctant to grow, as though the earth had decided it would not forgive what had been done in its name. For the people of Virginia, the scandal of St. Augustine was both revelation and curse. The exposed ledgers had torn through the fabric of the colony's elite like fire through parchment. Names once spoken with reverence now inspired disgust. Estates collapsed under the weight of public disgrace, and whispers of complicity followed every gathering of the wealthy. But society, as always, found a way to heal itself through selective amnesia. By the dawn of the 19th century, the story of the seminary had already begun to fade into rumor, a scandal rewritten by its survivors into something more palatable, more distant. They spoke not of the experiments, nor the dead boys beneath the chapel, but of a failed institution, an unfortunate episode in the moral development of the new American nation. The Randolph family, whose confessions had sparked the seminary's downfall, became both martyrs and pariahs. Their public admission of guilt of smuggling, corruption, and human exploitation had shattered the web of silence Sterling once commanded. But in doing so, They had severed their own lineage from privilege. Thomas Jefferson Randolph never returned to commerce. The wealth that had once ensured his family's comfort vanished in lawsuits and forfeitures. What remained was conscience, a burden heavier than gold. He devoted the rest of his life to exposing hidden abuses across Virginia, testifying in courtrooms where powerful men squirmed under the same light they had once feared from Father Sterling. Yet despite his efforts, redemption never felt complete. He was haunted by a single memory, the last glimpse of his brother, pale and trembling in the seminary's catacombs, whispering prayers to a God that had remained silent. Charles Randolph lived, but he never truly returned. For years after the fire, he wandered the edges of sanity, calm one moment, lost the next. He would wake in the night screaming hymns he could not remember learning, then fall into hours of stillness so deep that Thomas feared he had slipped away again. Physicians called it melancholia. Thomas called it punishment. Sometimes Charles would murmur fragments from the seminary's rituals: to surrender is to see the light, to resist is to remain in darkness. Then he would shudder, cover his ears, and whisper. The voices never stopped. He died in 1806, found kneeling beside his bed, a Bible open to the book of Job. The page was stained with candle wax and tears. On the margin, in unsteady handwriting, he had written, "Faith was never meant to be obedience." Thomas buried him not in the family cemetery, but near the ruins of St. Augustine, where the earth was quiet and no prayers were recited. Martha Henley outlived them both. In her later years, she was seen rarely, always cloaked in black, walking the roads of Williamsburg at dusk. Children whispered that she carried a box filled with names, the names of every boy who had died in Sterling's hands, and that she recited them each night to keep their spirits from fading. Whether true or not, her silence became its own legend. She died in 1824, and when her small house was cleared, the box was found. Inside were folded letters, brittle and yellowed, addressed to mothers who had never known how their sons died. Each letter began with the same words: "Forgive the silence that was bought with your sorrow." The government of Virginia, shamed by its own entanglement in the affair, initiated reforms that historians would later call the Augustine Resolutions. Religious and educational institutions were placed under new oversight. Any seminary or boarding school receiving wealthy students had to report directly to colonial inspectors. It was a bureaucratic solution to a moral disease, and like most such solutions, it cured the symptoms, not the cause. In London, meanwhile, whispers of Father Sterling persisted. Some claimed he had resurfaced under a new name, advising British officials on colonial intelligence. Others swore he had joined a secret society dedicated to spiritual governance. But no record of his death was ever found. His name slipped into rumor, and rumor slipped into myth. By 1847, the ruins of St. Augustine had almost disappeared beneath the ivy. A new landowner purchased the estate, intending to build a private retreat on its grounds. Workers clearing the rubble uncovered strange remnants, fragments of iron restraints, shards of stained glass, and beneath one crumbling wall, a sealed door that led to a forgotten passage. When they broke through, the air that escaped was colder than winter. Inside, they found chambers untouched by the fire. On the walls, etched by an unsteady hand, were words that no one could explain: "Truth sleeps where silence prays." Among the debris, they also found something far stranger, a single black ledger, half burned but legible. Its first page bore the familiar handwriting of Edmund Sterling. The experiment failed. They mistook control for salvation, but the will of man remains the most perfect cage of all. The discovery caused a brief stir in Richmond. Newspapers printed sensational accounts of the cursed seminary of Henry County, turning its horrors into Gothic entertainment for readers hungry for scandal. But after a few weeks, the story faded once again into legend. The landowner sealed the tunnels and built his manor directly above them. Guests spoke of strange noises at night, whispers that drifted through the floorboards, the faint tolling of a bell where none existed. The local clergy performed blessings, the sounds never stopped. In time, the story of Father Sterling became just another ghost tale told beside hearths on stormy nights. Parents warned disobedient sons that the priest of St. Augustine still walked the woods, searching for wayward heirs to refine. But among the few who had truly known, among the families who had paid for their secrets with their children, the silence endured. They built schools, founded charities, and donated to churches, all to cleanse their names. Yet beneath their philanthropy lay the same fear that had birthed Sterling's empire, the fear of exposure. History, after all, does not bury its horrors. It learns to speak them softly. When the seminary's final stones were removed in the late 1840s, the workers discovered one last artifact, a cracked bronze crucifix, blackened by soot. Beneath it lay a small scroll sealed with wax. The message inside was simple, unsigned, and chillingly familiar. You cannot save what refuses to confess. No one claimed it. No one spoke of it again. The ruins were cleared, the manor completed, and the memory of St. Augustine faded from public record. But on certain nights, when the wind moves through the hollows of Virginia and the moonlight touches the old river, travelers say they can hear faint hymns echoing through the mist, voices that do not sound entirely human. And if one listens closely between the verses, another voice can be heard, calm, persuasive, and unending. To resist is to remain in darkness. To surrender is to see the light. No one knows where the voice comes from, but those who hear it never pray the same again. A tale of faith twisted into control, of families undone by their own secrets, and of one man who turned confession into commerce, proving that the most enduring prisons are not built of stone, but of silence.